The Magi give gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And in this last episode of our series, we're going to talk about the myrrh and its symbolic connection to Jesus' life. But even beyond that, how God used all three gifts to do something that not even the Magi saw coming. When was the last time that you used myrrh? If you're like me, the answer is never. I don't know if I've ever encountered myrrh before, but it's one of the gifts that the Magi bring, in addition to the gold and the frankincense. And if you've been following throughout this short series, you will know that the ancient gold supply came out of Nubia, which is North Sudan, and that both frankincense and myrrh are found locally in the Horn of Africa and then in the Arabian Peninsula, specifically in Yemen. And so same origin as frankincense, which we talked about in our last episode. Now, whereas the frankincense came from the boswellia tree, the myrrh actually comes from what is called a commiphora tree, and there are a couple of different variations there, but a very similar process of cutting into the tree and getting the raw resin from the tree and then mixed with some oils and whatnot in order to be used, again, very similar to frankincense, for perfumes, for incense, and also for medicinal purposes. And so here's a picture of some myrrh alongside of the frankincense. Again, very, very similar in nature on how you harvest them and their uses together. But in addition, myrrh was also used as a stimulant, although that has been disputed, almost kind of like a painkiller. But also, what we do know emphatically is that it was used for burial purposes in preparing a corpse. And interestingly, myrrh is something that shows up in addition to the story of the Magi 2 more times in the gospel stories, both in connection to Jesus' death. So notice this passage from Mark 15:23, where Jesus is on the cross, and it says, "Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it." So obviously the alcohol content in the wine was intended to dull the pain that Jesus was feeling on the cross, and it was very common for someone to be in really painful situations like a crucifixion or whatnot for wine to be offered. But this inclusion of myrrh has just really kind of stirred the imaginations of scholars trying to figure out exactly what is myrrh's purpose here. And that's why some people have said, well, it's kind of like something that also dulls the pain, but that has been disputed. And so we don't entirely know what the purpose was emphatically for the myrrh to be mixed with the wine here to be used in the context of Jesus' crucifixion. What we do have is myrrh is present at the crucifixion, the dying process that Jesus is going through. And then notice how it is used in the Gospel of John. John states this: "He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. And Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. So this was a very common usage in the ancient world, was to use myrrh for wrapping the bodies. Now, the Jewish people did not practice embalmment, but when they were preparing the bodies for burial, they would use, as you have here in this passage, aloes as well as myrrh in order to put on to the body. And so very interestingly here, we have that myrrh is connected to Jesus' death and burial in the Gospels story. Now, very early on among our church fathers, a couple in particular, Irenaeus and Origen, saw symbolic meaning not just with the myrrh, but with the gold and the frankincense as well, around the roles that Jesus' life would play out, or the identity of Jesus. And one of the things that both of these early church fathers talked about was the idea that gold represents Jesus' kingship. that gold was fit for a king, and the Magi bringing the gold was symbolic of Jesus being king. And not just symbolic of Jesus being king, we know that he is king, but how they understood Jesus to be king, gold was the appropriate representation. When it came to the frankincense, that it represented or it represents Jesus' priestly role or even his deity, as we explored in the last episode, frankincense in the Old Testament was used in the context of the tabernacle and for worship. And so they saw a symbolic connection between frankincense being used for worship and Jesus being divine or serving as a priestly role, that, as the book of Hebrews will go on to say, that he acted as our high priest in order to give us access to God. And then when it came to myrrh here, is that it was representative of his sacrificial death, or as his sacrificial death as a suffering Savior on our behalf. Now, this idea was very early, and it's gotten carried throughout history to the point that this symbolism that began with these early church fathers became the back structure to one of the most famous hymns around Christmas, "We Three Kings of Orient Are," which was a hymn that was composed by John Hopkins Jr. in 1857. And I'm going to put the lyrics up here so that you can just see that in verse 2, you can see him connecting the idea of Jesus' kingship with the gold. In verse 3, you see the connection between the incense with deity. In verse 4, you have the myrrh being connected to the dying and the burial of Jesus in the tomb. And then in verse 5, he comes right out and makes those connections as king, God, and sacrifice. And so this is something that has been talked about for some time. And when you look at this, you ask the question, did the Magi do this on purpose? Did they know what they were doing? And the answer is probably not. As we explored in the first episode, gold, frankincense, and myrrh were common gifts that were given to a king. And so we would expect those to be part of the narrative if you know anything about the ancient world. But the idea that the Magi coming, in addition to the gold, which was just always fit for a king, frankincense is going to connect to the fact that he's going to be like this high priest, or that he's actually divine, and that the myrrh that we're talking about this episode is going to somehow be connected to his sacrificial death. I don't think they had a clue about that. And so the symbolic meaning that is often ascribed to these gifts, they do actually play out in the scriptures, but I don't think the Magi knew that when they gave those gifts. What we can say here is that the Magi's gifts were providential. This is something that God was going to use these gifts in a significant way. Now again, starting with the early church fathers, they started to see a symbolic connection to these gifts, but there's actually another purpose that is more substantial and founded at least implicitly in the text. And that is that when Herod finds out that he has been outwitted by the Magi and breaks out into this murderous outrage, he's going to send his men to Bethlehem and the surrounding area and kill all the baby boys 2 years old and under, in accordance to the timetable that the Magi had given to him. And ahead of that, an angel shows up and says to Joseph, grab Mary and the baby and flee to Egypt, because Herod is going to try and kill him. Now, what we believe from the biblical text is that Mary and Joseph are actually poor, and that the gifts that the Magi brought actually fueled their flight to Egypt as political refugees. Now, some of you may be asking, well, how do we know that Mary and Joseph were poor? And it comes down to what is recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, that when Jesus is presented at the temple, notice the passage here at the very end, what they offer and what is referenced here is a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons. If you go to Leviticus 12, this is actually the gifts of the poor. That if you were of means, you were well-to-do, you offered a different gift. But if you offered 2 doves or young pigeons, that was the gift of the poor. And so Mary and Joseph are likely a very young, poor couple who now has baby Jesus, and Herod, the most powerful man in the entire region, is out to get you, to try to make the trek all the way to Egypt. That was not an insignificant trek. I mean, that would require great expenses not only to get there, but also to remain there, and they don't know how long they're going to be there. But the providential gift of God to them through the Magi actually worked on behalf of Mary and Joseph and Jesus in ways that they had no idea when they received the gifts from the Magi, nor do I believe that the Magi had any idea that this is how God was going to use their gifts. And here's what's compelling to me in all of this, is that the Magi gave these gifts out of what they believed was obedience to God, or what they believed was the right thing to do. And what's compelling about this is that God often uses the gifts we give in ways that we could never foresee. And here's the thing. The Magi probably never found out about how those gifts were used. Like, God will take gifts that we give and use them in ways that we'll never even notice or we'll ever find out. But in other ways and in other times, we might find out how God used that particular gift. And I just wonder how often we miss out on God wanting to use something that we can offer in a way that is way beyond we could have ever imagined. But because we don't understand what God is doing, or we don't understand what God is asking us to do, we actually don't do the very thing that God is asking us to do. And what would have happened had the Magi not shown up and offered those gifts? I'm sure God would have provided another way, but the gifts of the Magi got to be used in ways they could have never foreseen coming. And that's how God works. And so I just want to leave you with this question. Is there anything God is asking you to do that you don't understand? You may not be able to figure it out, but it's not your role to figure out what God is doing. Your role is to do what God is asking you to do. And if God is asking you to do it, He's going to use it in a significant way. And you may never know the impact that this particular decision you make has, but maybe you will. But either way, we give in order to be obedient. And this is what the Magi did. They gave gifts that were costly, they gave gifts that were courageous, and they gave gifts that were providential. God used them in ways they could have never imagined. But how cool to be part of the story in that way. So may we be people who give the gifts that God is asking us to give, and may we experience His presence anew in this amazing Christmas season. Thank you all for joining us for this series. And as always, may you walk out the text well in your life.